I once paid a stranger's mortgage on a whim. Total strangers. I saw their story on a local news segment, felt a pang of something, and made a phone call. It cost me $80,000, and I didn't even blink. Today, I check the price of ground beef at the supermarket, and sometimes decide to wait for a sale. You want to know how I lost $15 million? The real story isn't in the spectacular crash. It's in the quiet, insidious moment I forgot what a single dollar was worth. Most folks, when they hear my story, they lean in with a kind of morbid curiosity. They ask, "James, what does it feel like to lose $15 million?" It's a fair question, I suppose. It's the kind of epic failure that becomes a legend, a ghost story told by financial advisors to scare their clients straight. But they're asking the wrong question. It's like asking a shipwreck survivor only about the moment the ship hit the iceberg. It misses the entire point of the voyage. The real question, the one that haunted my sleepless nights for a decade and took another to finally answer, isn't how I lost it all. It's why I ever constructed a reality for myself where I genuinely, unshakably believed that I couldn't. To understand that, you have to travel back with me, 30 years. Back to a version of myself I barely recognize. I wasn't the man whose face was briefly famous, whose name became a synonym for a colossal flameout. I was just James. James Thatcher, senior accountant at a mid-level firm downtown. My life was the color beige. I'm not being poetic, it was a literal fact. I lived in a beige-carpeted apartment with beige walls, drove a beige Toyota sedan that was offensively reliable, and I spent 8, sometimes 10 hours a day in a beige cubicle, under the soul-sucking hum of fluorescent lights. My entire world was a symphony of muted, unoffensive tones. My job was to be the meticulous caretaker of other people's ambitions. I would audit, balance, and file away the profits of titans of industry. Men who wore handmade Italian shoes and treated $100,000 losses as the cost of doing business. I saw their risks, their massive wins, and their calculated failures. And every day as I reconciled their extravagant expenses, a quiet, desperate fire was kindling in my gut. It wasn't simple envy of their money, their cars, their lives. It was an acute, painful jealousy of their courage. They were players in the great game of capital, moving markets, building empires, failing and rising again. I was just keeping score for them. I was a footnote in their story. Every day was a carbon copy of the last. I'd eat the same sad turkey and Swiss on whole wheat at my desk, the bread just a little bit stale, and I'd dream of a different life, a life with color, a life of consequence, a life where my decisions mattered. That dream, I knew, had a price tag. It was a concrete number I had fixed in my mind, $10,000. That was my escape velocity. For 10 grueling years, I saved every spare cent. It was a silent vow I made to myself. It was a decade of skipped vacations, watching friends send postcards from Greece and Hawaii while I patched a leak in my roof. It was a decade of driving that old Toyota until the engine rattled and the radio only picked up static, of politely declining dinners out with colleagues, of brewing my own cheap, bitter coffee at home. That $10,000 wasn't just money in a bank account. It was a tangible, heavy thing. It was my 20s sacrificed, my deferred gratification, my one and only lottery ticket, all condensed into a number in a passbook savings account that paid an insulting 0.5% interest. My wife at the time, Sarah, a wonderfully grounded and sensible woman whom I loved dearly, saw that account as our future. It was the down payment on a small house in a decent school district. It was our safety net, a cushion against the harsh realities of the world. But I saw it as a launchpad, a weapon, my one shot at the stratosphere, and I knew, with the certainty of a zealot, that I had to take it. I wasn't a gambler by nature. My entire professional life was dedicated to mitigating risk, to finding certainty in columns of numbers. I couldn't just walk into a casino and put it all on black, so I decided to attack the stock market, not as a gambler, but as a cryptographer. I was going to break its code. My tiny apartment transformed into a command center. The small dinner table where Sarah and I ate vanished under mountains of financial reports, analyst ratings, prospectuses, and market trend charts I'd printed out at the office. I started a ritual. I'd come home from work, have a quick dinner, And then, from 7 p.m. until 2 a.m., I would descend into that sea of paper. I taught myself everything. I learned to read a balance sheet, not just for what it said, but for what it didn't say. I devoured books on value investing, on market psychology, on economic history. Coffee became my lifeblood. My world shrank to the numbers on those pages. I was hunting for an inefficiency, a market blind spot, a diamond so deeply buried in the dirt that the Wall Street giants, with all their powerful algorithms and teams of analysts, had deemed it worthless. They were looking for home runs. I was looking for a fundamental miscalculation, a piece of value the entire world had overlooked. And after 6 months of relentless, obsessive, eye-straining digging, I found it. The company was a needle in a haystack, a name so obscure it felt like a secret. It was a small tech firm out of Palo Alto called Omnicore Dynamics. They were working on a data compression algorithm that was, from my deep dive into their technical patents, at least 5 years ahead of its time. It was elegant, efficient, and potentially revolutionary. But their management was composed of brilliant engineers who were abysmal at business. Their marketing was non-existent, their investor relations a joke. Their stock was languishing at $1 and change, ignored by the big players and written off as a failing hobby project. But every metric I had taught myself to trust screamed that this company was a coiled spring. Their debt was negligible. They had a fortress of intellectual property. Their cash burn rate was sustainable for another 2 years without new funding. The world saw a dying star. I saw a supernova waiting to happen. I laid out my thesis to Sarah one night, spreading the charts across the living room floor. I explained my entire process, my voice filled with a passion she hadn't heard in years. I told her my plan. I wanted to liquidate our savings, all $10,000, and put every single cent into this one unknown stock. She looked at me, her face pale. She saw the manic gleam in my eyes, the stacks of paper, the exhaustion. All of it, James, our entire future. On one idea. It wasn't an idea, I told her, my voice more forceful than I intended. It was a calculation. It was the only logical move. But I could see the profound fear in her eyes. This was the precipice. Stay in the beige world of predictable safety, or take a leap of faith into the terrifying, colorful unknown. My hand trembled as I logged into the new bare-bones brokerage account I had opened. The screen glowed in the dark room. Clicking that confirm purchase button was the single most terrifying act of my life. It felt like stepping off a cliff. The entire sum, 10 years of my life, my entire net worth, vanished from my savings account and reappeared as 6,500 shares of Omnicore Dynamics. For the first week, I was a wreck. I felt physically ill. The stock did nothing. It bobbed up a few cents, down a few cents. I thought I'd made a catastrophic, arrogant mistake, but every time the panic rose, I went back to my research. The numbers hadn't changed. The patents were still valid. The logic was sound. I had to trust the analysis, not the churning acid in my stomach. Then about 3 months later, on a sleepy Tuesday afternoon, the world changed. A major tech conglomerate, a household name, announced an unexpected strategic partnership with Omnicore. They were licensing the algorithm for their entire next generation of products. The market, which had been blissfully ignorant, suddenly woke up. My phone started buzzing with news alerts. In one day, the stock jumped 40%. The next week, as analysts scrambled to understand what they had missed, it doubled. I watched, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird, as my $10,000 gamble climbed. $20,000, $50,000, $100,000. The temptation to sell was a physical scream in my head, a primal instinct telling me to take the astonishing win and run back to safety. But my analysis, my cold, hard logic, had a target price, a number based on projected royalty earnings where I believed the company would be fairly valued. It wasn't there yet. I held on, my knuckles white, my faith now fully transferred from hope to the certainty of my own intellect. 18 months after my initial investment, the stock blew past my target price in a frenzy of acquisition rumors. With a calmness that surprised even me, I logged in and sold every last share. The final number that settled in my account, after commissions, was 252,318. I just stared at it for a full hour. I hadn't just made money. I had proven my thesis. I had gone to war with the market's conventional wisdom, and I had won a crushing victory. I had taken my one shot and obliterated the bullseye. That night I didn't celebrate wildly. I took Sarah to the fanciest restaurant in the city, a place we used to walk past and dream about. And for the first time in my adult life, I didn't look at the prices on the right side of the menu. It was such a small thing, but it felt like the ultimate symbol of freedom. With that $250,000 as my new war chest, I repeated the process. I didn't get reckless. If anything, I became more disciplined. I poured the same obsessive energy, the same relentless research into finding the next Omnicore. I spent months hunting, and I found another one, a small medical device company with a revolutionary stent patent. And another after that, a logistics software firm nobody understood. My methodology was sound. It was my sacred gospel. I was unemotional, analytical, and utterly ruthless in my pursuit of undervalued assets. The $250,000 became $500,000. $500,000 grew to 800,000, then 9. And then, one grey Tuesday afternoon, 2.5 years after that first terrifying click, it happened. A successful clinical trial result from the medical device company sent its stock soaring. It was the final push. I logged in, and the number at the top of the screen read $1,340. $1 million. The feeling that washed over me was not relief. It wasn't even pure joy. It was something far more potent and far more dangerous. It was validation, a powerful, intoxicating wave of pure, unadulterated rightness. I wasn't lucky. Luck was for amateurs. I was smarter. I hadn't gambled. I had executed a flawless intellectual strategy. I had conquered. I stood up from my desk in my slightly less beige apartment, looked out the window, and I didn't see the dreary street below. I saw a world of possibilities, a world that was now mine to command. I was hungry, I was focused, and I felt utterly and completely invincible. That hunger for success, for breaking out of the mold. Does it resonate with you? If it does, do me a favor and subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments what city or country you're watching from and what dream you're chasing right now. It helps to know you're not alone on the journey up the mountain. In that moment, standing there a newly minted millionaire, I felt like an architect of my own destiny. I believed I had found the cheat code to the universe itself. I was no longer keeping score for other men. I was the one winning the game. And that belief, that absolute, unwavering belief in my own infallibility. It was the very thing that built my glimmering heaven, but it was also the tiny, poisonous seed of my own spectacular destruction. That first million wasn't the summit of the mountain. It was merely the base camp from which the real ascent began. The principles that got me there, the obsessive research, the emotional discipline, the calculated risk, were sound. They were my climbing gear, my oxygen, my map. And for a time, I used them to scale heights I had never imagined. The first million doubled to 2 in less than a year. The market was a raging bull, and I felt like I was the one whispering in its ear. Every position I took, every company I analyzed, turned to gold. It was a surreal, intoxicating period where I felt I could do no wrong, that I had tapped into the very rhythm of the global economy. By my 35th birthday, my net worth had eclipsed $5 million. By my 36th, it was knocking on the door of 8. The beige world I had inhabited didn't just fade away, it was obliterated, nuked from orbit. I sold my modest apartment and bought a statement, a monument to my own success. It was a sprawling house of glass and white stone, perched on a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The western wall was a single, uninterrupted pane of glass, and every evening the sunset would bleed across my Italian marble floors. I'd stand there, a glass of impossibly expensive scotch in my hand, and watch the waves crash below, feeling not like a man who owned a house, but like a god surveying his own creation. The beige Toyota was replaced by a British racing green Aston Martin, a machine of such exquisite power that simply turning the key felt like an event. Its guttural roar was the sound of my arrival. My life became a curated collection of expensive experiences. My suits were no longer off the rack. They were bespoke, tailored to my frame by old men in London who had dressed royalty. I ate at restaurants where the chefs were celebrities, and a single plate of food cost more than my old weekly grocery budget. Money, I discovered, didn't just buy things, it bought access. It was a key that unlocked a hidden world. Suddenly, I wasn't just reading about the titans of industry, I was shaking their hands. I was invited to exclusive golf tournaments, to private art viewings, to charity galas where the price of a dinner table could fund a small-town school for a year. In these rooms, my former bosses, the men I once served with quiet deference, now approached me, their hands outstretched, asking what I thought about the market. The validation was a drug more potent than any narcotic, and this is where the cracks began to appear. Not in my portfolio, but in me. The foundation of my own character started to erode. The James who spent hundreds of hours deciphering patent filings and balance sheets began to seem like a foolish, naive creature. Why dig through dusty reports in a lonely room when I could get a sure thing whispered to me over brandy by a hedge fund manager at the country club? My research methodology transformed. It was no longer about forensic accounting, it was about proximity to power. I started to believe that the information traded in these gilded rooms was fundamentally superior to anything a common man could find. I mistook gossip for gospel. The most insidious change was in my own self-perception. I stopped seeing my success as the result of a replicable, laborious process. Instead, I began to believe it was the result of an innate, almost mystical talent. I had a gut feeling, a golden touch. I wasn't just smart or hardworking, I was a prodigy, a market visionary who could see the future. This belief was intoxicating, and it was a poison. It absolved me of the need for the very discipline that had made me successful. The work became an insult to my genius. Why should a king labor like a peasant in the fields? Sarah saw it happening before I did. She was my anchor to the real world, the last vestige of my beige life, and I began to resent her for it. She wore the beautiful clothes I bought her, lived in the glass palace, but she never seemed truly comfortable there. Her feet were still firmly planted on solid ground, while my head was soaring in the clouds. One evening, as we were getting ready for yet another black tie event, she sat on the edge of our enormous bed and looked at me with an expression of profound worry. "James," she began, her voice quiet. "I was looking at the accounts today. Almost everything we have, every single penny, is still in the market, in these aggressive tech stocks." I was adjusting my bow tie, looking at my reflection in the mirror. I saw a man of power, of influence. "Of course," I said, a little too cheerfully. "The market is where the growth is, sweetheart. You don't get rich by hiding your money under a mattress." "I know that," she said, her patience already wearing thin. "But we have more than enough, more than we could ever need. Why don't we take some of it out? Just a portion. We could buy an apartment building, get some rental income. Or bonds. Something safe. Something tangible. Something for the kid's future that isn't just a number on a screen." I turned from the mirror and looked at her. And in that moment, I didn't see the woman I loved, the partner who had stood by me when we had nothing. I saw an obstacle. I saw a lack of vision. I saw fear. A small, condescending laugh escaped my lips. "Bonds? Sarah, bonds are for dentists and old ladies. It's a surrender. You don't build an empire by playing defense, you build it by taking territory. You have to trust me. I know what I'm doing." Her eyes hardened. "I did trust you, James. I trusted the man who worked all night at the dinner table, the one who was careful and brilliant. This new man, the one who makes million-dollar decisions based on a conversation at a cocktail party, he scares me." The accusation stung, precisely because it was true. "That's because you don't understand the game at this level," I said, my voice cold and sharp. "This is how it's played. You're still thinking like a poor person. You have to get over that." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and toxic. The cruelty of it silenced her. She saw then what I couldn't, that I had begun to equate prudence with poverty, caution with cowardice. She was trying to protect our family, and I was treating her like she was trying to sabotage my destiny. That conversation was the first major fissure, a deep crack in the foundation of our life together, and instead of mending it, I walked out the door and went to the party. The party was a charity auction, a glittering affair held in the grand ballroom of a five-star hotel. This was my new natural habitat. I moved through the crowd with an easy confidence, a master of this universe, and it was here that I met Marcus Thorne. Thorne was old money, a genuine billionaire with a portfolio that spanned shipping, real estate, and private equity. He was the kind of man I aspired to be, effortless, powerful, utterly assured. We fell into a conversation about the market, and I found myself trying to impress him, dropping names of stocks I was in, hinting at my massive returns. He listened with an amused smile, then leaned in, his voice a low, conspiratorial whisper. "That's all child's play, Thatcher. You're chasing percentages. The real money is in paradigm shifts." He swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "I'm on the board of a little biotech firm, Agerian Pharmaceuticals. They're on the verge of a breakthrough in gene therapy. Phase 3 trial results are due in a month. It's a lock. The stock is going to the moon. We're talking a 10-bagger minimum." My heart began to pound. This was it. This was the inside track. This was information you couldn't get from a financial report. This was a king anointing a prince. My mind, the old analytical tool, screamed with red flags. What's the science? What's their cash burn? Who is the management team? But another voice, the loud, arrogant voice of my ego, drowned it out. It told me that asking those questions would make me look small. It would make me look like I didn't belong. A man like Marcus Thorne doesn't need to check the balance sheet. He moves markets. To be in his circle, I had to act like him. So I smiled, a cool, knowing smile. "Sounds interesting, Marcus. I'll have my people look into it." He chuckled. "By the time your people look into it, the rocket will have left the launch pad." He was testing me, I knew it. He was seeing if I was a tourist in his world or a resident. Right there in the middle of the crowded ballroom, with the string quartet playing softly and champagne flowing, I made a decision. It wasn't a financial decision. It was a social one. It was an act of pure, unadulterated ego. I pulled out my phone, opened my brokerage app, and with Marcus Thorne watching me with that same amused expression, I put in a market order. I bought $2 million worth of Agerian Pharmaceuticals. I didn't do a shred of due diligence. I didn't even read the company's mission statement. I just clicked confirm. I put my phone back in my pocket and met his gaze. "Done," I said, my voice steady. A slow grin spread across his face. He clapped me on the shoulder. "Welcome to the club, Thatcher. Welcome to the club." As he walked away to mingle with other titans, I stood there alone for a moment, a strange feeling washing over me. It was a cocktail of exhilaration, power, and a tiny, almost imperceptible shiver of fear. The 62-year-old man telling you this story now knows what that shiver was. It was the sound of a key turning in a lock, trapping me in a prison of my own making. All of my founding principles, my discipline, my research, my logic, were thrown out the window for a single pathetic reason. I needed to prove to a man I'd just met that I was worthy of his attention. I had just signed a contract, not with my broker, but with my own vanity. And the fine print written in invisible ink was my soul. It was the beginning of the end. The month that followed my impulsive $2 million biotech gamble was one of the most transformative periods of my life. But the transformation was cancerous, a malignant growth of pride that was metastasizing through my soul. Every morning I'd wake up, and the first thing I'd do, before even saying good morning to Sarah, was check the stock price of Agerian Pharmaceuticals. It became a ritual, a morning prayer to the gods of greed. And the gods, it seemed, were listening. The stock ticked up, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum as whispers of the upcoming trial results began to leak into the financial news. I was living on a knife's edge of adrenaline, and I mistook the feeling of anxiety for the thrill of genius. Then the day of the announcement came. I was in a board meeting for a tech company I now held a significant stake in, but I wasn't present. My mind was elsewhere. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I excused myself, my heart hammering against my ribs, and walked into the hallway. The headline of the press release was a cascade of clinical jargon, but the words that mattered were simple. Phase 3, trial exceeds all primary endpoints. The market's reaction was instantaneous and savage. The stock, which I had bought at around $30 a share, exploded. It gapped up to 60, then 80, then broke $100 a share by midday. My $2 million bet, made on a whim to impress a billionaire, had turned into 4 million, then 5. By the end of the week, my position in Igarian was worth nearly $6 million. I had made more money in 1 week, based on a single whispered tip, than I had made in my first 3 years of obsessive, backbreaking research. This was, without a doubt, the single worst thing that could have possibly happened to me. A rational man would have seen it as a lucky break, a fortunate roll of the dice. He would have taken the monumental profit, thanked his stars, and reinvested it according to a sound, diversified strategy. But I was no longer a rational man. My ego, which had been whispering to me for years, was now screaming in triumph. This wasn't luck. It was destiny. It was proof. It was the universe confirming what I already knew in my heart. I was special. I was different. I possessed an instinct, a market sense that transcended mere data. The discipline that had been the bedrock of my success now seemed quaint, pedestrian, the crutch of a lesser mind. My victory with Igarian validated my arrogance. It cemented it into the core of my identity. My fortune, which had been at 8 million before, now rocketed past the $10 million mark. I was no longer just a millionaire. I was a decamillionaire. The number had a certain weight, a certain finality. It felt like I had graduated to a new level of existence, a place where the normal rules of financial gravity no longer applied to me. This newfound sense of infallibility began to poison my relationships. The people who had known me the longest, the ones who represented my before, became increasingly irritating to me. My old friends from my accounting days would call, and I could hear the mixture of awe and bewilderment in their voices. They would ask for advice, and I would offer pronouncements with the unearned confidence of a prophet. When one of them gently suggested I should be careful, that markets can turn, I remember cutting him off. "The market only turns on people who don't understand it," I said, a statement of such breathtaking hubris that it makes me cringe to even recall it. He never called me for advice again. My most strained relationship, of course, was with Sarah. Our home had become a silent battlefield. She saw the change in me, the manic energy, the growing obsession not with wealth but with the idea of my own genius. She saw me becoming a stranger, a caricature of the man she had married. She would try to talk to me about the children, about school events or family matters, and I would be distant, my eyes glazed over, my mind consumed with stock charts and deal flows. I was physically present, but emotionally absent, a ghost in my own home. I began to see her concern not as love, but as an anchor holding me back. She represented the world of limits, of caution, of normalcy, and I was convinced I was destined for something far beyond that. So I began to retreat, to build a fortress around myself, and I populated it with new people. My new friends were not friends at all, they were courtiers. They were the yacht brokers, the art dealers, the private bankers, the other high-rolling investors who populated the world I now inhabited. Our conversations were a constant unspoken competition. Who had the bigger win, the more audacious risk, the more exclusive access? They were an echo chamber of my own burgeoning ego. They applauded my recklessness because it validated their own. They never questioned my decisions. They only praised my courage and my vision. I was surrounding myself with mirrors that reflected the exact image of myself I wanted to see. The infallible titan, the market maestro. It was in this echo chamber that I conceived of what I called the generational play. I had become convinced that simple diversification, spreading one's assets across various sectors, was a strategy for fools. It was a guarantee of mediocrity. True visionaries, I reasoned, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the new tech billionaires, didn't diversify. They focused. They found the one great transformative wave of the future, and they rode it with absolute, singular commitment. They bet the farm. I decided I knew what that wave was. It was the convergence of artificial intelligence and genomic medicine. The idea of using AI to map, understand, and even rewrite human DNA seemed to me to be the single most important technological revolution of the 21st century. It was going to change everything about human existence, from disease to aging, and I wasn't going to just take a small position in it. I was going to own a piece of the revolution itself. I became a zealot for the sector. Over the next 6 months, I systematically liquidated almost everything else in my portfolio. The solid, profitable positions in manufacturing, in consumer goods, in boring but reliable dividend stocks, they were all sold. I funneled every last dollar of my $10 million fortune into a small concentrated handful of highly speculative, unproven companies at the bleeding edge of AI-driven genomics. These weren't established pharmaceutical giants. They were startups, cash-burning rockets fueled by venture capital and audacious promises. My entire financial empire was now balanced on the head of this single technological pin. Sarah, when she found out, was devastated. It was the final catastrophic breach of her trust. Our arguments became hollow and desperate. She was pleading for the man she married to come back, and I was looking at her as if she were a heretic, questioning my new religion. One afternoon, while I was sitting in my glass-walled home office, a copy of a prestigious financial magazine lay on my desk. On the cover was an interview with a man named Julian Croft, a legendary value investor in his 70s, a man widely regarded as one of the wisest minds in finance. His track record was impeccable, built on decades of cautious, intelligent investing. The headline of the article was a stark warning: Echoes of 1999, the AI biotech bubble. In the interview, Croft laid out a meticulous, data-driven case for why the very sector I was all in on was dangerously overvalued, driven by hype and speculation rather than real-world earnings or viable products. He called it a speculative fantasy. I read the article, and I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated rage. It felt like a personal attack. This old man, this dinosaur, was too blind to see the future. He was stuck in the past, a relic of a bygone era. I couldn't let it stand. The next week, I agreed to an interview with a rival publication, my first major public profile. And I used the platform to attack him. I didn't engage with his arguments or his data. I engaged in a character assassination. I called Julian Croft a fearful mind from a fearful generation, a man who was standing on the shores of history, terrified of getting his feet wet. The article was published, and it made waves. I was portrayed as the young, audacious visionary taking on the old guard, and my echo chamber roared its approval. A week later, I was on my new boat, a sleek 70-foot yacht I'd named the Apex. We were anchored off the coast, the sun was warm, and the champagne was cold. My broker called. My portfolio was performing well, but he was nervous. "James," he said, his voice laced with professional anxiety, "your concentration in this one sector is unprecedented. Your entire net worth is leveraged on a single idea. It's incredibly risky." I laughed, a loud, confident sound that carried across the water. "Risk is for people who don't know what they're doing, John. I know exactly what I'm doing." Then I delivered the killing blow to his caution. "In fact," I said, looking out at the endless horizon, "I think we're underinvested. I want you to set me up with a margin account. I want to leverage the portfolio. Let's start with $3 million. I want to buy more on the dip." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear him calculating the catastrophic potential of what I was asking. He tried to protest, to explain the mechanics of a margin call, how it could wipe me out completely. I cut him off. "Just get it done, John." As I hung up the phone, I felt a surge of power that was almost divine. I had defied the cautious, I had scorned the wise, and I had doubled down on my own vision against the advice of my own professionals. Standing on the deck of my yacht that day, the ocean stretching out before me, the sun on my face, I felt like a modern-day god, bending the world of finance to my will. But gods, as the ancient stories tell us, have a fatal flaw. They have hubris. They bleed. And my self-inflicted wound, deep and septic, was about to be torn wide open for the entire world to see. The decision to use leverage was not just a financial tactic, it was a declaration of faith. It was me, pushing all my chips to the center of the table, not just betting on a sector, but betting on my own mythos. The $3 million of borrowed money flowed into my portfolio, allowing me to accumulate even larger positions in my chosen handful of AI genomics companies. And for a short, brilliant, terrifying moment, my apotheosis seemed complete. The sector, already frothy, went on another parabolic run. A rival firm announced a major breakthrough, and the entire industry was lifted on a tidal wave of speculative euphoria. My portfolio's value, now artificially inflated by the borrowed capital, surged. The numbers on the screen became almost meaningless, abstract symbols disconnected from reality. 12 million, 13, 14. Then one bright October morning it crested the peak. My brokerage account, including the leverage, showed a net worth of $15,250,000. This was it, the pinnacle. I had taken $10,000, the sum of a decade of frugal living, and spun it into a fortune that placed me in the rarefied air of the ultra-wealthy. I had done it on my own terms, scorning the timid advice of the old guard and trusting my own audacious vision. I was no longer just a player in the game. I felt like I was the game. My public profile exploded. The magazine article in which I had derided the legendary Julian Croft had positioned me as a maverick genius, the face of a new, fearless generation of investors. I was invited to speak at financial conferences, to appear on television programs, to give interviews about my method. I stood on brightly lit stages and spoke with the unshakable conviction of a true believer, preaching my gospel of singular focus and aggressive conviction. I told people that diversification was a lie sold by the financial industry to guarantee mediocrity. I told them that the future belonged to the bold, and they listened, hanging on my every word, their faces a mixture of awe and aspiration. I wasn't just managing money, I was curating my own legend. But the higher I climbed, the thinner the air became and the more disconnected I was from the world below. My life was no longer my own. It was a performance. I was playing the part of James Thatcher, the market visionary, and the role was consuming me whole. My home, that glass palace on the cliff, had become a gilded cage. The beautiful sunsets no longer brought me peace. They were just a backdrop for extravagant parties where I held court, surrounded by my sycophantic followers. We would drink vintage wine and talk in grand terms about disrupting industries and building new paradigms. A circle of self-congratulation that insulated me from any dissenting voice. The most devastating cost of this ascent was my family. The crack that had formed between Sarah and me had widened into an unbridgeable chasm. We were living as strangers under the same roof. The tenderness was gone, replaced by a polite, icy distance. She had stopped trying to reach me, had retreated into her own world, focusing all her energy on protecting our children from the vortex of my ego. I remember one evening, I came home late from some celebratory dinner. She was waiting up, sitting in the dark, a single lamp illuminating her face. She looked exhausted. "The school called," she said, her voice flat. "You missed Michael's parent-teacher conference. Again." I sighed, loosening my tie. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I was in a meeting with the board of neurogenics. It was unavoidable." "Everything is unavoidable, James," she replied, a deep well of sadness in her voice. "Your son's life is becoming avoidable. Don't you see what's happening? You're not here anymore. A ghost in a handmade suit walks through this house, but my husband, the father of my children, he's gone." I had no answer, because I knew she was right. I had become an abstraction, a net worth statement. The love I had for my family felt distant, a memory from a former life. In my grand quest to provide them with everything, I had robbed them of the one thing they actually needed: me. A few weeks later, I came home to find a note on the perfectly polished kitchen island. She was taking the children to stay with her sister for a while. She needed space. She needed to breathe. The note was calm, reasonable, and utterly heartbreaking. And the most terrifying part: a small dark corner of my soul was relieved. She was the last mirror that showed me the truth of what I was becoming, and now that mirror was gone. I was finally, completely, alone in my echo chamber. With my last real tether to reality severed, my obsession with the market became absolute. I watched the ticker symbols like a hawk, my mood swinging violently with the daily fluctuations of my chosen stocks. And the first signs of trouble began to appear, not as a sudden crash, but as a series of small, unsettling tremors. One of the companies in my portfolio missed its quarterly earnings estimate. Its stock dropped 15% in a day. A week later, a key researcher at another of my companies resigned abruptly. hinting at internal turmoil. Its stock shed 10%. These were minor setbacks, but in a portfolio as ludicrously concentrated as mine, they were significant. My echo chamber of friends and advisors told me what I wanted to hear. It's just market jitters, James. A healthy correction. This is a great opportunity to buy more on the cheap. My own ego, now a raging inferno, refused to acknowledge the possibility of a mistake. Selling now, even a small portion, would be an admission of doubt. It would be a concession to the Julian Crofts of the world, and my pride could not tolerate that. So, instead of trimming my positions, I did the opposite. I called my broker and instructed him to draw down even more on my margin account, buying more shares of the very companies that were showing signs of weakness. I was no longer investing. I was trying to bend the market to my will, to force it to admit that I was right. The definitive warning, the final blaring alarm bell before the catastrophe, came in the form of an official notification from my brokerage firm. It was an email, clinical and devoid of emotion, with the subject line, "Preliminary Margin Maintenance Call Warning." I read the words, and a cold dread seeped into my bones, a feeling I hadn't felt since I was a poor accountant risking his life savings. The email explained that due to the recent downturn in my concentrated holdings, the equity in my account was approaching the minimum maintenance requirement. If the value of my stocks fell by another 5%, they would be forced to start liquidating my assets to cover the loan. They wouldn't ask for my permission. They would just start selling at whatever the market price was until the loan was secured. I was standing on a trapdoor, and the brokerage firm's finger was now hovering over the release lever. Any sane person would have taken this as a sign from God himself. They would have immediately sold off a portion of their holdings, paid down the margin loan, and moved to safety. It was the only logical, rational, self-preserving thing to do. But my logic was no longer my own. It was a hostage of my pride. I remember picking up the phone and calling my broker, John. His voice was strained. "James, you saw the email. You have to act. We need to sell at least $4 million worth of stock. Today, to get you back to a safe equity level." I was silent for a long moment, staring out the floor-to-ceiling window of my office. Below me, the city glittered, a universe of lights that I believed I had conquered. Selling felt like a retreat. It felt like a surrender. More than that, it felt like an admission that Julian Croft, the old dinosaur, might have been right. It would be a public humiliation. My entire manufactured identity was built on the premise that I was never wrong. If I sold now, that identity would shatter. "We're not selling a single share," I said, my voice as cold and hard as the glass in front of me. "James, you don't understand," he pleaded, his professional calm cracking. "This isn't a request. If the market opens down on Monday, the decision will be out of your hands. Our risk management department will liquidate you. You could lose everything." "It's a manufactured panic," I snapped back, parroting the deluded narratives I'd been telling myself. "The weak hands are being shaken out before the next big leg up. This is the moment of maximum opportunity. Selling now would be the height of foolishness." He was speechless. He couldn't argue with a zealot. I hung up the phone. I walked to the window, placing my hand on the cool glass. I looked down at the city, at the cars moving like tiny, insignificant blood cells in the veins of the metropolis. I had come so far, from a beige cubicle to this Olympian height. I had built an empire from nothing. To retreat now, to admit even the possibility of a flaw in my grand vision, was simply unthinkable. It was a fate worse than financial ruin. In that moment, I would have rather been penniless than proven wrong. And so, I decided to hold, to stand my ground, to stare into the abyss and not blink. It was the single most expensive decision in the history of my life. A multi-million-dollar bet placed not on a stock, but on the infallibility of my own ego. The trapdoor beneath me began to creak. Before I tell you how the house of cards finally came crashing down, if you've journeyed with me this far into my hubris, do me a small favor and click that subscribe button. This final, brutal act is the most important part of the entire story. And while you're at it, comment below, looking back at my journey, what do you believe was my single greatest, most fatal mistake? I'm curious to see if you can pinpoint the exact moment the poison took root. That weekend, after I'd arrogantly dismissed my broker's desperate plea, was one of the strangest and most surreal of my life. I was living on an island of pure denial, surrounded by a rising sea of objective reality. I actively avoided anything that might contradict my worldview. I didn't turn on the financial news. I didn't read the weekend papers. Instead, I spent my time in a self-constructed cocoon of affirmation. I reread the glowing articles about myself. I revisited the online forums dedicated to the stocks I owned, forums filled with other true believers who, like me, saw the downturn not as a warning, but as a holy test of their conviction. They called themselves the Diamond Hands, and I, their unofficial king, saw their fervor as a reflection of my own genius. I spent Saturday afternoon on my yacht, the Apex, sailing alone. The ocean was calm, the sky a perfect, cloudless blue. And in that serene setting, I managed to convince myself that I was the calm in the center of a storm of lesser men's panic. This wasn't a financial crisis. It was a crisis of courage in the market, and I was one of the few who had the strength to hold the line. I felt a perverse sense of pride, of defiant strength. I was Horatius at the bridge, a lone warrior holding back the barbarian hordes of doubt. The truth is, I was a deluded general celebrating a victory on the eve of his own annihilation. Sunday night was different. The denial began to fray at the edges. As the Asian markets opened overseas, the first trickles of bad news began to find their way to me. A colleague sent me a text. Seeing heavy selling in our sector in the Hong Kong exchange. Hope you're okay. A knot of ice formed in the pit of my stomach. I couldn't sleep. I found myself pacing the vast, empty rooms of my glass house, the moonlight casting long, skeletal shadows on the marble floors. For the first time, a sliver of genuine, terrifying doubt pierced my armor of arrogance. What if I was wrong? The question, once unthinkable, now echoed in the cavernous silence of my life. Monday morning came. I was in my home office before dawn, my face illuminated by the glow of 3 monitors, a cup of coffee growing cold beside me. I was waiting for the pre-market trading session to begin in New York. And at precisely 4 a.m. Eastern Time, the abyss opened up. It wasn't a dip. It wasn't a correction. It was a massacre. The catalyst was the perfect storm I had believed could never happen. It was a 3-pronged assault. First, a bombshell report had been released overnight by a notoriously meticulous short-selling firm, alleging accounting fraud and falsified clinical trial data at Neurogenics, the largest holding in my portfolio and the cornerstone of my entire strategy. Second, in a completely unrelated event, the U.S. government announced the formation of a special task force to investigate pricing and anti-competitive practices in the biotech sector, sending a shockwave of regulatory fear through the entire industry. And third, general sentiment had soured, with fears of an interest rate hike causing a broader market sell-off. My hyper-concentrated boat was caught in a Category 5 hurricane. The pre-market numbers were a bloodbath. Neurogenics was down 60%. The other stocks in my portfolio were down 30 to 40%. The screen was a wall of crimson, a cascade of horrifying red numbers. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching a movie about someone else's ruin. The numbers were too large, the drop too precipitous to feel real. My $15 million empire was evaporating in the digital ether before my eyes. The opening bell at 9:30 a.m. was not a bell. It was a guillotine. The carnage from the pre-market session spilled over into a full-blown panic. Trading volumes exploded, as institutional investors and retail speculators alike stampeded for the exits. My screens flickered, the numbers dropping so fast they were a blur. 14 million. 12. 10. My phone rang. It was John, my broker. His voice was no longer pleading or anxious. It was hollow, devoid of all emotion. It was the voice of an undertaker. "James," he said, the word clipped. "It's happened. You're deep into a margin call. The risk management department has taken control of the account. We are liquidating. I'm legally obligated to inform you." "What? What do you mean?" I stammered, my own voice sounding alien to me. "You can't sell. Not at these prices. It's the bottom." "There are no prices, James," he said, his voice flat. "There are only bids. We are hitting every bid we can find. The system is doing it automatically. I have no control. You have no control. It's over." I was paralyzed. I was a king locked in a tower, forced to watch through a tiny window as his kingdom was sacked and burned to the ground. I watched the execution in real time. Green boxes flashed on my screen, each one representing a block of my shares being sold at a catastrophic loss. 100,000 shares here, 200,000 there. Every sale locked in a devastating, irreversible loss and triggered further panic, pushing the prices even lower. I watched the number, the great and powerful number that had defined my existence, go into freefall. 8 million, 5, 3. I felt my breath catch in my chest, my vision narrowing to a tunnel focused on that single, malevolent number. 1 million. Then the number dipped below 7 figures and a sound, a guttural, wounded animal sound, escaped my throat. 500,000. 100,000. And then, in the span of about 45 brutal minutes, it hit 0. But it didn't stop. Because I owed the brokerage firm $3 million, plus interest. The liquidation continued, selling my shares to pay back their loan. When the smoke cleared, when the last share had been sold at a humiliatingly low price, the number at the top of my screen was no longer a beautiful, empowering black. It was a vicious, accusatory red. Negative $2,477,000. I had not just lost $15 million. I had vaporized it. I had turned one of the market's great fortunes into a multi-million-dollar debt. I was less than worthless. The rest of the day, the rest of the week, was a blur of cascading consequences. The fall wasn't just a 45-minute event. It was a slow, grinding demolition of my entire life. The first calls were from John's superiors, men in suits whose voices were like steel, informing me of my debt and outlining the immediate steps they would be taking to collect. Then came the calls from the banks that held the mortgages on my house and my yacht, triggered by clauses in my loan agreements regarding a material change in my net worth. Then came the credit card companies, slashing my limits to almost nothing. The friends and courtiers who had toasted my genius vanished like mist. Calls went to voicemail. Emails received automated out-of-office replies. I was no longer a member of the club. I was a contagion, a walking symbol of failure they were desperate to avoid. Marcus Thorne, the man who had started it all with his whispered tip, never returned a single one of my calls. Within a week, I was sitting in the sterile beige office of a bankruptcy attorney. He was a kind but unsentimental man who spoke in the cold, precise language of financial death. He used words like insolvency, Chapter 7, and full liquidation of personal assets. He explained that everything had to go. The process was methodical and utterly humiliating. Appraisers, men with clipboards and dead eyes, walked through my beautiful glass house, placing little price tags on my life's acquisitions. The art on the walls, the designer furniture, the $1,000 suits in my closet. The worst day was when they came for the Aston Martin. I watched from the window as a man in greasy overalls hooked it up to a tow truck. He didn't handle it with any care. To him, it was just another repossession. As he drove it away, its beautiful green form disappearing down the winding coastal road, I felt a piece of my identity being physically ripped from me. The yacht was next, seized at the marina. The final act was the auction of my house. I wasn't there, but I saw the pictures online. Crowds of strangers walking through my personal spaces, picking through the remnants of my former life, sold off to the highest bidder. My monument to success was now just another foreclosure. The process culminated a few months later in a drab, soulless room at the federal bankruptcy court. I stood before a trustee, answered a series of questions under oath, and with the stroke of a pen, officially declared myself destitute. My debts were discharged, but I was left with absolutely nothing. I walked out of that government building into the harsh afternoon sun, wearing an ill-fitting suit I had bought at a second-hand store. My pockets were empty. The man who had once paid a stranger's mortgage on a whim didn't have enough money for a taxi. I saw a bus pulling up to the curb. I fumbled in my pocket, found a few loose coins, and got on. As I sat down on the cracked vinyl seat, surrounded by the anonymous faces of the city, the enormity of my fall finally crashed down on me. In the span of a few months, I had gone from a titan, a visionary, a master of the universe, to this, a ghost. A nameless man on a city bus, staring out the window at a world that no longer recognized him. I hadn't just lost my money, I had lost my name. I had no idea who James Thatcher was supposed to be without the millions that had defined him. The bus ride from the courthouse was the longest journey of my life. Every stop, every new passenger, was a fresh reminder of my new status. I was anonymous, invisible, a ghost in the machine of the city. I ended up at the apartment of the only friend who hadn't abandoned me, Dave, a colleague from my old accounting firm, the same one I had once condescendingly dismissed for advising caution. He didn't judge. He didn't say, "I told you so." He just opened his door, pointed to a lumpy sofa bed in his small living room and said, "Stay as long as you need." His simple, unquestioning kindness was so profound, it almost broke me. The months that followed were a grey, featureless fog of shame and apathy. I was a man hollowed out. My days were spent on that couch, staring at the water stains on the ceiling, replaying every catastrophic decision, every arrogant pronouncement, every ignored warning. Sleep offered no escape as my dreams were haunted by the ghosts of my former life, the roar of the Aston Martin's engine, the view of the sunset from my glass wall, the feel of $1,000 suit against my skin. I would wake up with my heart pounding, drenched in a cold sweat, the phantom limb of my wealth aching with an almost physical pain. To contribute to the rent, Dave helped me get a job. It was the only thing my old skill set was good for at this point. I became a bookkeeper for a small family-owned chain of hardware stores. My new office was a cramped, windowless room in the back of a warehouse, smelling of sawdust and industrial cleaner. I was back in a beige world, but this was a far harsher shade. I spent my days reconciling invoices and tracking inventory, my hands dusty from handling paperwork, my back aching from a chair that had been old in the 90s. The irony was almost poetic. I, who had once moved millions with a click of a mouse, now spent hours hunting for a $3 discrepancy in a till receipt. The humiliation was a constant low-grade fever. The worst part was the fear of being recognized. I would wear a baseball cap pulled down low whenever I left the apartment, but one afternoon it happened. A man came into the warehouse to pick up a special order. He was wearing an expensive watch, the kind I used to collect. He glanced at me, did a double take, and his eyes widened in disbelief. "James Thatcher?" he asked, his voice a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. "I saw you speak at the Aspen Summit a few years ago. What on earth are you doing here?" The question hung in the dusty air. The other warehouse workers stopped what they were doing and stared. In that moment, I felt myself shrink. I was naked, my spectacular failure laid bare for all to see. I mumbled something about a career change, my face burning with a shame so hot it felt like it could peel my skin off. He just shook his head, a look of pity and fascination on his face, and walked away. That night, I didn't go back to Dave's apartment. I just walked, for hours. I ended up on a bridge overlooking the dark, swirling water of the river, and I understood for the first time how a man could simply choose to step off the edge of his own life. The only thing that stopped me was the thought of my children and the final, ultimate shame that such an act of cowardice would bring upon them. That was the bottom, the absolute nadir. And it is only from the bottom that you can begin to build again. The turning point didn't come in a flash of divine inspiration. It came in a quiet moment of human connection. A few weeks later, there was a knock on Dave's apartment door. It was my son, Michael. He was 19 then, a college student. I hadn't seen him in nearly a year. He stood in the doorway, taller than I remembered, looking at the shabby apartment, at my unshaven face and my tired eyes. I braced myself for anger, for accusations, for the righteous indignation of a child whose inheritance I had incinerated. But that's not what happened. He just looked at me, his gaze steady, and asked a simple question. "Are you okay, Dad?" 4 words. That's all it took. Not "what did you do?" or "how could you?" Just, "Are you okay?" And with those 4 words, the dam of pride and shame and grief that I had built inside me finally broke. I collapsed onto the lumpy sofa, buried my face in my hands, and I sobbed. I wept for the first time since I was a child. I cried for the fortune I had lost, for the family I had broken, for the man I had failed to be. Michael didn't say anything. He just came in, closed the door and sat next to me, placing a hand on my shoulder. And in his quiet, unassuming presence, I felt the first flicker of something I hadn't felt in years. Grace. He wasn't seeing a failure. He was seeing his father. That moment was a rebirth. It was the beginning of clawing my way back, not to wealth, but to worth. My first task was the hardest. I had to face Sarah. I called her and asked if she would meet me for coffee. She was hesitant, but she agreed. We met at a small anonymous diner, the kind of place I would never have been seen in before. I didn't make excuses. I didn't try to explain my market theories or blame my downfall on a perfect storm. I just looked her in the eyes and I apologized. "I'm sorry, Sarah," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I am so sorry for my arrogance, for my pride. I'm sorry for being a terrible husband and a distant father. I got lost. I fell in love with a version of myself that wasn't real, and I abandoned you and the kids in the process. You deserved so much better." She listened, her expression unreadable. And then she nodded, a single, slow nod. "I know, James," she said softly. "I just wish you had figured that out sooner. We didn't get back together. The damage was too deep for that, but we found a new kind of relationship, one built on honesty and a shared love for our children. We began to co-parent again, properly. The ice had thawed. It was in the quiet solitude of my new humble life, living in a small one-bedroom apartment I could finally afford on my bookkeeper's salary, that the great lesson of my journey finally crystallized. I had spent years believing that the goal of the game was to accumulate money, but my catastrophic failure taught me that money is nothing more than an amplifier. It's a magnifying glass. It doesn't create your character, it simply reveals it in large print for the entire world to see. The money hadn't made me arrogant. It had just given my pre-existing arrogance a bigger stage to perform on. It hadn't made me neglect my family. It simply amplified the ambition that I had already chosen to prioritize over them. It hadn't made me greedy. It had just revealed the depths of a hunger that was already there. I lost a $15 million empire, but in doing so I was liberated from the prison of the ego that had built it. I was freed from the crushing, exhausting weight of having to be James Thatcher, the market visionary, every single day. I discovered a new kind of wealth, a wealth that cannot be leveraged and that no market crash can ever take away. It's the richness of a quiet morning with a good cup of coffee. It's the profound value of a long conversation with my son. It's the simple peace of mind that comes from knowing who you are when you have nothing to your name. I look at my life now. I live in a small apartment. I tend to a little garden on my balcony. I still work as a bookkeeper. I even find a certain Zen-like satisfaction in it now, in the simple act of bringing order to chaos. I have friends, real friends, who like me for who I am, not for what I can do for them. I will never be rich again, not in the way the world measures it. But I am wealthier now in my soul than I ever was at the peak of my power. So, here is the ultimate lesson. The true measure of a man's worth is not found in the balance of his brokerage account. It's found in the strength of his character when that account is empty. We spend our lives chasing numbers on a screen, believing they will bring us happiness and security. But the most important asset you will ever own is your own integrity. Don't let your ego write a check that your soul can't cash, because I promise you it will always bounce, and the collection fee is a bitch. If this message, born from the ashes of my own failure, resonated with you, I ask you to do one thing. Share this video with someone in your life who might need to hear it. And finally, in the comments below, I'd like you to share the greatest lesson about money or life that you have ever learned. I will read every single one of your answers. Thank you for listening.